Paterson is 8.5 square miles wedged into the bend of the Passaic River, about 16 miles from Midtown Manhattan. In 2020, a quarter of its residents lived below the poverty line. By 1983, the New Jersey Historical Commission had already named it the 5th poorest city in America. The town that had called itself Silk City, the Iron City, and the Cotton City was by that point in what the Commission called economic ruin. But here is the thing that makes Paterson different from every other American city that went broke. Paterson didn't just happen to become industrial. Paterson was designed as a factory. It was the first planned industrial city in the United States, and the man who planned it was Alexander Hamilton. That fact alone should stop you for a second. Not a settlement, not a port, not a crossroads where traders met and a town grew up around them. Paterson was a business plan. It was incorporated not as a municipality, but as a corporation, the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, chartered by the New Jersey legislature in 1791. And the charter that Governor William Paterson signed, the city's namesake, who was also a signer of the Constitution, granted the SUM extraordinary powers: the right to hold property, condemn land, divert water, build canals, and operate free from property taxes for 10 years. Some historians would later argue that this charter was the original sin. The writer Christopher Norwood accused the SUM of having no relation to its citizens. Paterson was, from its first breath, a city designed to produce things, not to be a place where people lived. Hamilton had visited the Great Falls of the Passaic River in 1778 during the Revolution, reportedly with George Washington. The falls dropped 77 feet in a thundering curtain of whitewater, one of the largest waterfalls on the eastern seaboard. Hamilton looked at that cascade and did not see beauty. He saw power. He saw thousands of spindles turning, looms clacking, trip hammers pounding, all driven by a force that never tired, never struck, and never asked for wages. In 1791, as Treasury Secretary, he made his move. He hired Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the same man who had just laid out the plan for Washington, D.C., to design a system of raceways, canals cut into the basalt rock that would channel the river's energy to mill after mill along the gorge below the falls. L'Enfant's plan was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. He proposed an aqueduct and a channel blasted through solid rock. The SUM's directors grew impatient. They thought he was taking too long and spending too much. They fired him and replaced him with Peter Colt, who designed a simpler, cheaper system of raceways. It was a pragmatic choice, and it set a pattern that would repeat itself in Paterson for the next 2 centuries. The grand vision, followed by the cheaper version, followed by just enough to keep the machines running. By 1794, the first water-powered cotton spinning mill was operational, and then the first manufactory. The SUM's own attempt at running a factory failed within 2 years. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Hamilton's great industrial experiment cratered almost immediately. The SUM didn't close, but it quietly abandoned manufacturing and reinvented itself as something much more durable: a landlord. It became a real estate and energy broker, leasing water power and building space to private entrepreneurs. For the next 150 years, the SUM would not make a single product. It would simply sell the falls. And the entrepreneurs came. The SUM's pivot from manufacturer to landlord turned out to be, almost accidentally, brilliant. Anyone with skill and ambition could lease water power and mill space along the raceways cheaply enough to start a business. A weaver who wanted to set up for himself didn't need much capital. He needed experience, a few good workers, and a lease from the SUM. This created something unusual, a city with a very low barrier to entry, where immigrants and tinkerers could start small and, if the market cooperated, grow fast. The population climbed from 500 in the 1790s to over 5,000 by 1820, and the growth would not stop for 100 years. This is the period when Paterson began accumulating the kind of resume that sounds like boasting but isn't. In 1828, Paterson mechanics joined mill workers in what historians record as the first sympathy strike in the United States, a labor milestone in a city that would eventually be defined by its labor conflicts. 3 years later, in 1831, a machinist named Thomas Rogers, who had spent nearly 20 years building textile equipment, set up a shop called Jefferson Works in Paterson. Within a year, he partnered with 2 New York investors, Morris Ketchum and Jasper Grosvenor, and began building railroad locomotives. Rogers, Ketchum, and Grosvenor would become the second largest locomotive manufacturer in the country. Together with 2 other Paterson firms, Danforth Cook and Company and the Grant Locomotive Works, the city produced over 10,000 steam locomotives. They were dragged through the streets by teams of horses to reach the railroad because the factories were built along the raceways, not the rail lines. A Rogers locomotive, number 119, was one of the 2 engines that met at Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, when the Golden Spike was driven to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. That engine was built in Paterson, New Jersey. Population at the time, roughly 33,000. In 1835, a young inventor named Samuel Colt set up shop in a mill along the raceways and began producing the first marketable repeating cylinder revolver. It became known as the Colt Paterson. Within a few years, Colt moved his operation to Hartford, Connecticut. He is remembered as a son of Hartford. But the revolver that opened the American West was born in Paterson, powered by the same water that spun cotton thread. And then there was John Philip Holland, an Irish-born schoolteacher who built experimental submarines and tested them in the Passaic River in 1878 and 1881. 2 of those early vessels, one of which sank and was later dredged from the riverbed, sit today in the Paterson Museum, which is housed in the old Thomas Rogers locomotive erecting shop on Market Street. A submarine, a revolver, a locomotive that linked a continent, all from the same 8.5 square miles, all powered by the same 77-foot waterfall. But none of those industries defined Paterson the way silk did. Silk was first manufactured in the city around 1840, but it didn't become dominant until after the Civil War, when high tariffs on imported silk products gave American producers an edge over their European rivals. By the 1880s, Paterson was producing nearly half of all the silk made in the United States. The jacquard loom, introduced in the early 1870s, enabled the weaving of intricate patterns, ribbons, broad silks, military ceremonial attire, and Paterson's mills mastered it. By 1910, the city had 300 factories employing 25,000 workers, doing about $40 million worth of business a year. It was weaving roughly 30% of the country's silk. The city earned its most famous nickname, Silk City. Some called it the Lions of America, which is why, when they built that city hall, they looked to Lion for the blueprint. Garrett Hobart, the Paterson lawyer and power broker whose statue would stand in front of that building, had become vice president under McKinley in 1897. The idea that a small city in northern New Jersey would produce a vice president seemed perfectly natural. Paterson was, after all, the 15th largest city in the country, a place where 106,000 people lived and worked among the most productive factories on earth. At its peak, Paterson produced not only silk, but the machinery to make it, the looms, the winding equipment, the dyeing apparatus. An entire ecosystem of engineers, mechanics, dye chemists, designers, and merchants had grown up around the fiber. The city even manufactured the diners that fed the workers. The Silk City Diner Company, later the Paterson Vehicle Company, built those iconic stainless steel Art Deco diners in a plant on East 27th Street, shipping them out on flatbed trucks like ships being launched. The silk era produced a world unto itself. Waves of immigrants arrived to work the looms, Irish and Germans first, Then Italians from the Piedmont and Naples, Jews from Poland and Russia, Syrians who by 1900 owned dozens of silk mills themselves. The Dutch came in such concentrated numbers that 90% of emigrants from South Holland to the United States settled in just 3 American towns, and Paterson was one of them. Master dyers were recruited from traditional silk centers in Lyon and Como, brought their craft across the ocean, and trained apprentices in the chemical arts of color. The dye houses were the most dangerous workplaces in the city. Men standing all day, dipping skeins of silk thread into vats of hot chemicals. But the weaving mills were kept surprisingly clean, because the fiber was so valuable that any contamination could ruin a bolt worth hundreds of dollars. Good lighting was critical. The newer mills were designed with banks of tall windows to let in as much natural light as possible. The city's commercial life boomed alongside the mills. Behind Newark and New York, Paterson was the 3rd largest brewing center in the region. Half a dozen breweries, Braun, Spratler, and Mennel, Graham, the Katz brothers, Burton, merged in 1890 to form the Paterson Consolidated Brewing Company. The Hinchcliffe Brewing and Malting Company, founded in 1861, produced 75,000 barrels a year from a state-of-the-art facility on Governor Street. All of them would be wiped out by Prohibition. But in their heyday, the beer flowed as freely as the river. And the Silk Era produced a figure who, more than anyone, embodies the arc of Paterson itself. Kathalina Lambert was born in 1834 in a village called Gooseeye in Yorkshire, England. At 10 years old, he was put to work as an errand boy in a cotton mill. At 17, in 1851, he took his 12-year-old brother William, pooled their savings of £5, and sailed from Liverpool to New York. He found a bookkeeping job in a Boston silk house for $4 a week. Within a few years, he had been offered a partnership. Within a decade, he owned the firm. He moved to Paterson, took over silk mills, and built his company, Dexter, Lambert and Company, into the largest silk producer in the United States. In 1892, Lambert began building a castle, not a mansion, a castle, fashioned after the stone fortresses he had walked past as a boy on his way to the cotton mills of Yorkshire. He called it Belle Vista and placed it on Garrett Mountain, overlooking the city and the falls and every silk mill that had made him rich. He filled it with an art collection that rivaled J.P. Morgan's, hundreds of European and American paintings and sculptures. President McKinley visited. In 1896, Lambert added a 70-foot observation tower and a 100-foot art gallery. Standing on that tower, you could see the smokestacks of his mills below, and on a clear day, the skyline of Manhattan beyond. There is a detail about Lambert that only becomes significant later. Among his hundreds of paintings was a small work he believed was by Andrea Salai, a pupil of Leonardo da Vinci. Lambert thought it was a copy. It wasn't. While Lambert was building his castle, the city below was being tested in a way that would have destroyed lesser places. On February 9, 1902, shortly after midnight, an overheated stove in a trolley shed on Broadway caught fire. Winds of 60 miles an hour turned the blaze into what one witness called a whirlwind of flames. The fire tore southeast through downtown, leaped the Erie Railroad tracks, and drove into Sandy Hill, a residential neighborhood of wood frame houses with shingled roofs. Paterson's fire department was badly equipped, old steamers throwing weak streams of water, and made a critical error. They concentrated on the downtown core without sending companies downwind to protect the residential neighborhood from the shower of embers and firebrands. By the time the fire burned itself out near a cemetery the following afternoon, it had destroyed 459 buildings across 26 city blocks. The list of structures lost reads like a civic inventory. City Hall, the public library, the high school, 5 churches, 4 banks, the YMCA, the Hamilton Club, the offices of 2 newspapers, the Garden Theater, and hundreds of homes and businesses. Damage was estimated at $6 million, over $200 million in today's money. It was the worst fire in New Jersey's history. Less than a month later, on March 2nd, the Passaic River flooded the downtown. Months after that, a tornado tore through the city. 3 disasters in a single year, as if something were testing the city's will to exist. Mayor John Hinchcliffe refused outside help. He wanted to prove Paterson could rebuild itself. And it did, with remarkable speed. The wooden downtown was replaced with brick and stone, built in the Beaux-Arts style that was fashionable at the time. The buildings that went up between 1903 and 1910, 4 to 7 stories tall, with ornamental cornices and arched windows, still line the streets of downtown Paterson today. They are, according to architectural historians, the finest collection of turn-of-the-century commercial architecture in New Jersey. The city built them to last. It assumed there would always be a city that needed them. The silk industry didn't just survive the fire, it peaked afterward. By around 1910, Paterson was at its zenith. 106,000 people living in the 15th largest city in America, with the most powerful industrial district on the East Coast, a vice president's hometown, a city hall modeled on Lyon, and a silk baron living in a castle on the hill. It is hard to overstate how much confidence was in the air. Paterson had been repeatedly knocked down, depressions, floods, fire, tornado, and had come back every time. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't keep coming back forever. But in the winter of 1913, something broke that the city could not rebuild in brick and stone. On January 27th, 800 weavers at the Doherty Silk Mill walked off the job. The issue was looms. The company wanted each weaver to operate 4 at once instead of 2. The workers saw it as a speed-up that would eliminate jobs. Within weeks, the strike had spread to every silk mill and dye house in the city. 25,000 workers were out. 300 mills and dye houses went silent. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, sent their most famous organizers, Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Carlo Tresca. Flynn held meetings for women strikers. Haywood addressed crowds in half a dozen languages. The police arrested strikers by the hundreds. Nearly 1,900 were jailed over the course of the strike. On June 7th, something happened that had never been attempted before and has never quite been replicated since. Over 1,000 striking workers boarded a special 13-car train from Paterson to New York, marched up Fifth Avenue while the IWW band played La Marseillaise, and performed a dramatic reenactment of their own strike at Madison Square Garden. The journalist John Reed, who would later write 10 Days That Shook the World, directed the pageant. The artist Robert Edmund Jones designed the poster. On top of Madison Square Garden's tower, the letters IWW glowed in red lights. Workers played themselves. They recreated the picket lines, the police violence, the funeral of Valentino Modestino. A bystander, not even a striker, shot dead on his own porch by a private detective while holding his child. The audience wept. The pageant filled Madison Square Garden, but it did not fill the strike fund. The $1 and $2 seats went mostly empty. Workers and sympathizers were let in for 10 cents, or free. The event finished $2,000 in debt. By late July, starving families could hold out no longer. The strike collapsed. The owners conceded nothing. Workers lost an estimated $5 million in wages. The owners lost $10 million in profits. 2 people had been killed, and Paterson silk manufacturers, victorious but shaken, began quietly making plans to leave. They didn't all go at once. Some moved looms to annexes in eastern Pennsylvania, where labor was cheaper, taxes lower, and workers less likely to organize. Some held on in Paterson through sheer inertia, but the bleeding had begun. In 1924, 20,000 silk workers struck again over the same 4-loom issue. This time the manufacturers didn't fight. They simply accelerated their departure. By 1925, although 700 plants still operated in the city, they were far smaller than before. The introduction of rayon, artificial silk, was already eating into demand for the real thing. The city that had staked everything on the finest fiber in the world was watching that fiber become obsolete. Katharina Lambert did not survive the transition. The 1913 strike, combined with the onset of the First World War, which choked off capital and disrupted international supply chains, devastated his fortune. He mortgaged the castle. In 1916, at age 82, he auctioned off his life's collection, 368 paintings, 32 sculptures. He sold one of his silk factories. He and his son Walter began liquidating Dexter, Lambert and Company. To his credit, Lambert paid every debt. He died in 1923 in the castle, which his family then sold to the city. The city sold it to Passaic County a few years later. 40 years after the auction, art historians identified one of the paintings Lambert had sold, the one he thought was by a pupil of Leonardo, as an actual Da Vinci. He had let it go for $1,950. By the time it was authenticated, it was valued at over $1 million. Had he known what he had, it might have saved his company. But he didn't know, because he was a silk man, not an art dealer. And in 1916 in Paterson, even silk men were going under. The city tried to reinvent itself one more time. In 1919, the Wright Aeronautical Corporation moved its headquarters to Paterson from New Brunswick, leasing space in a building on what was then called Lewis Street. Wright had roots going back to the company Orville and Wilbur Wright founded in 1909. In Paterson, the company hired Charles Lawrence, a pioneer in air-cooled engine technology, and began developing the Whirlwind radial engine. By 1926, the Wright factory along the Erie Railroad tracks had expanded into a massive complex of 4-story reinforced concrete buildings, modern, functional, utterly unlike the old brick mills along the raceways. On April 1, 1927, a 24-year-old engine builder named Tom Rutledge completed the assembly of a Wright Whirlwind J5C engine, serial number 7331. Rutledge was reportedly disappointed with the assignment. The engine was destined for an unknown male pilot named Charles Lindbergh, and Rutledge would have preferred a more prestigious client. 7 weeks later, that engine carried Lindbergh across the Atlantic. Paterson had, once again, built the thing that changed the world. Wright merged with Curtiss Aeroplane in 1929 to form Curtiss-Wright. By 1932, the Paterson facility was described as the largest airplane engine factory in the United States, employing over 2,400 workers. Lewis Street was renamed Lindbergh Place. Then came the war. During World War II, the Paterson plant ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, with a workforce that swelled to at least 24,000, and some estimates put the total Curtiss-Wright employment in the area, including nearby Clifton and Caldwell plants that produced propellers, as high as 50,000. Over the course of the war, the Paterson facility alone produced more than 77,000 aircraft engines, over half of Curtiss-Wright's total wartime output. The company built 2.3 million square feet of new manufacturing space. Women filled the factory floor as men left for the front. The city's African-American population swelled as thousands moved north for defense industry jobs, part of the same great migration that was reshaping every industrial city in the Northeast. Those engines powered the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-25 Mitchell bomber, the Dauntless dive bomber, and the B-29 Super Fortress. The engines that carried the Enola Gay to Hiroshima were Curtiss-Wright Cyclones. Paterson was designated a likely target area. The fire department trained for chemical warfare, and 16 auxiliary fire companies were formed. For the last time in its history, the city had earned a new nickname, Aviation City. For a few years, it was the old Paterson again. Full employment, round-the-clock production, a city with a purpose. Lewis McDowell, who came to Paterson from Mississippi with his siblings in the 1930s, later remembered it as a beautiful little city. The streets, the factories, even the police. His family arrived 2 at a time, every year for 4 years, until all 7 brothers and sisters were settled and working. In those years, McDowell said everything was nice. He would eventually open McDowell's Barber Shop on River Street and become a local preacher. He pinpointed the city's golden twilight precisely. Between the 1930s and the 1950s, Paterson was itself. After that, it became something else. They even built a stadium, Hinchcliffe Stadium, a 10,000-seat Art Deco concrete amphitheater on a bluff above the Passaic River, had opened in 1932, named for the mayor who pushed it through, John Hinchcliffe, who had made his fortune in brewing before Prohibition shut him down. Workers laid off from the mills found employment building it under a New Deal program. The New York Black Yankees of the Negro National League made Hinchcliffe their home from 1933 to 1945. Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, Monty Irvin, they all played there. A young Paterson kid named Larry Doby played football and baseball at Hinchcliffe for East Side High School before being scouted by the Newark Eagles. In 1947, Doby broke the American League color barrier, 3 months after Jackie Robinson broke it in the National League. Lou Costello, who grew up in Paterson's Italian neighborhood and never stopped mentioning the city in his routines, performed with Bud Abbott at Hinchcliffe before boxing matches. Duke Ellington played there. The first televised New Jersey sporting event, a Hinchcliffe boxing card broadcast by Dumont, originated from those concrete stands. And then the war ended, and Paterson ended with it. Curtis Wright began shutting down the Paterson operation almost immediately. The workforce dropped from tens of thousands to a fraction. The company moved its remaining operations to the suburbs. In 1945, the same year the war ended, the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, Hamilton's 153-year-old corporation, the entity that had founded the city, controlled its water, leased its land, and governed its industrial life since 1791, sold its charter and remaining property to the city of Paterson. Think about that transaction for a moment. For a century and a half, Paterson had not fully belonged to itself. It had been, in a real legal and economic sense, the SUM's city, a company town without ever quite admitting it. Now, finally, Paterson owned Paterson. But by the time the city took possession of itself, there was almost nothing left to possess. The silk mills were gone or going. The locomotive works had been absorbed by Alco and shuttered in 1913. Curtis Wright was leaving. The raceways that L'Enfant and Colt had carved into the rock were crumbling. The falls still thundered, but the SUM had been diverting so much water, 75 million gallons a day out of a normal flow of 87 million, that the cascade Hamilton had admired was, at times, little more than a trickle. William Carlos Williams, the poet who grew up in Rutherford just down the river, called the Passaic the vilest swill hole in Christendom. He spent 20 years writing a 5-volume philosophical poem titled simply Paterson. The decline after 1945 was steep and relentless. It followed a pattern familiar to anyone who knows Newark, Camden, Gary, or Youngstown. But in Paterson, it had a particular cruelty, because the city had been through this before: the fire, the floods, the depressions, and had always rebuilt. This time there would be no rebuilding, because the problem wasn't destruction, it was irrelevance. The textile and apparel industries lingered, accounting for over 60% of manufacturing employment through the 1950s and 1960s, but they were a shadow of the old silk trade, small shops doing piecework, not the great mills that had woven 30% of the nation's silk. Rayon and nylon had killed the market for real silk. The factories that could modernize moved to cheaper locations. The ones that couldn't simply closed. By the end of the 1920s, Paterson's plants were already described as antiquated, unable to compete with newer facilities in other parts of the country. In Passaic County, the post-war development boom took place on vacant land in towns like Clifton and Wayne, which had space for the sprawling single-story factories and parking lots that modern manufacturing demanded. Paterson, boxed into its 8.5 square miles of 19th century street grids and multi-story brick mills, had no room to offer. Interstate 80, completed through the area in the 1960s, made it easier to bypass the city entirely. The highway that was supposed to connect Paterson to the broader economy instead connected the suburbs to each other, draining the city's commercial core even faster. The suburbs pulled the rest, malls in Wayne and Paramus, places that had been farms and fields when Paterson was building Beaux-Arts downtown blocks, drew the department stores and the shoppers. The chain retailers left. The middle class followed. In 1960, Paterson was 94% white. By 1990, it was 41%. This was not in itself the cause of decline. It was a symptom. The people who left were the ones who could afford to, and they took their tax base with them. The people who arrived, African Americans from the South during the Great Migration, Puerto Ricans beginning in the 1950s, later Dominicans, Peruvians, Colombians, came looking for the same thing every wave of immigrants to Paterson had always looked for: factory work. But the factories were gone. In 1970, the effective buying income per household in Paterson, $8,467, was the lowest in Passaic County. By 1983, it was the fifth poorest city in America. The unemployment rate hit 9.9%, nearly double the state average. The old Beaux-Arts buildings on Main Street and Market Street, the ones the city had built after the fire of 1902, the ones that were supposed to last, had their ornamental facades covered with cheap false fronts and oversized signs. Hinchcliffe Stadium, turned over to the school district, fell into disrepair and was finally closed in 1997. Weeds grew through the concrete. Graffiti covered the walls where Dobie and Gibson and Page had played. The Orpheum Theater on Van Houten Street, where vaudeville acts and movies had once drawn crowds, was converted into a mosque, Masjid Jalalabad, serving the growing Muslim community, accommodating 1,500 worshipers in the space where audiences had once watched double features. In January 1991, an electrical fire in a basement bar at 161 Main Street consumed nearly an entire city block, including the old Meyer Brothers department store. A firefighter named John Nicosia died in the blaze. The burned buildings were demolished. An outdoor mall was built in their place. There is a moment in the life of any declining city when the trajectory becomes self-reinforcing. The tax base shrinks, so services decline, so more businesses leave, so the tax base shrinks further. Paterson hit that moment somewhere in the 1970s and has never fully escaped it. By the late 1990s, services accounted for 35% of the city's economy, overtaking manufacturing for the first time. 56 different ethnic groups were represented in the city. Small businesses, bodegas, barbershops, restaurants, beauty salons replaced the mills as the economic engine. Market Street, once the commercial spine of a silk empire, became Little Lima to tourists, lined with Peruvian and Dominican storefronts. The city's story could end there, in a long gray fade, and in a sense it does. But the physical city, the actual stone and concrete and falling water, has a stubborn persistence that outlasts economics. The Great Falls were designated a National Natural Landmark in 1967. In 1976, preservationists, led by a woman named Mary Ellen Kramer, convinced President Ford to designate the Old Mill District a National Historic Landmark. In 2009, President Obama signed the legislation that would make the Great Falls a National Historical Park, formally established in 2011. A record 177,000 visitors came to see the falls in 2016. Jim Jarmusch set a film there that same year titled Paterson, partly inspired by Williams's poem, about a bus driver who writes poetry in a city of old brick and falling water. Lambert Castle was restored. The sandstone exterior was stabilized, deteriorated windows were replaced with historically accurate reproductions, and over 100 paint colors were matched to Lambert's original choices. The Passaic County Historical Society runs it as a museum. You can stand in the room where Lambert kept his art collection, the one that included an actual Leonardo da Vinci he didn't know he had, and look out at the city below. Hinchcliffe Stadium was saved. In 2009, a city councilman named Andre Sayeg visited Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama, and came home believing Paterson's crumbling amphitheater could be brought back. When he was elected mayor in 2018, he secured $94 million for a full restoration. In May 2023, the stadium reopened. Professional baseball returned. The New Jersey Jackals, an independent league team, moved in from nearby Little Falls. High school football resumed. The Thanksgiving Day game between East Side and Kennedy, a tradition going back to 1925, is played there again. It is one of only 4 stadiums still standing that hosted Negro League games. And the falls still fall. 77 feet of white water, the same cascade that Hamilton saw in 1778. The force that powered cotton mills and locomotive works and silk looms, and, indirectly, the engine that carried Lindbergh to Paris. The water doesn't care what the city does with it. It fell before the SUM, and it falls after. The raceways that Peter Colt carved into the basalt are dry now, their channels cracked, their sluice gates rusted open. The old mill buildings along the gorge, some dating to 1813, the oldest industrial structures in the district, stand in varying states of restoration and ruin. Brick walls, softened by decades of weather, windows dark or boarded. The Paterson Museum occupies the Thomas Rogers Building, the old erecting shop where locomotives were assembled before being dragged down Market Street by horse teams. Inside, you can see Holland's submarine pulled from the Passaic. You can see Colt Paterson revolvers, or you could, until someone stole them a few years ago. The street the Wright factory stood on is still called Lindbergh Place. The factory buildings, 4 stories of reinforced concrete, have been subdivided into small warehouses and light industrial spaces, their original steel frame windows mostly filled in with cinder block. On Market Street, the Beaux-Arts facades from 1903 still stand, though many have been altered beyond easy recognition. City Hall still stands, its clock tower still modeled on lion, its limestone still holding up. The statue of Garrett Hobart still faces Market Street. Hobart died in office in 1899 at 55. His death opened the vice presidential slot that would go to Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president after McKinley's assassination, meaning that if Hobart had lived, the entire trajectory of the American presidency might have been different. One more thing that nearly happened in Paterson. The city's population today is roughly what it was in 1920, about 160,000 people in 8.5 square miles, one of the most densely populated cities in America. The median household income is around $56,000. The poverty rate hovers near 25%. 64% of residents over the age of 5 speak a language other than English at home. Hamilton's experiment lasted 153 years. In that time, the falls powered a cotton industry, an iron industry, a locomotive industry, a firearms industry, a silk industry, and an aviation industry. Each one rose, peaked, and departed. The city was designed to be a machine, and machines, when they are finished with one task, are either retooled for the next or scrapped. Paterson was retooled 4, 5, 6 times. It produced the revolver that won the West, the locomotive that linked a continent, the silk that dressed a nation, and the engine that crossed an ocean. And then, one day, there was no next task, and the machine stood still. The falls keep going. 77 feet, year after year, the roar audible from the footbridge that crosses the gorge, the 8th bridge to span that chasm over the centuries. Below, the Passaic churns white and keeps moving, past the old mill walls, past the raceways, past Hinchcliffe Stadium on its bluff, past the spot where Holland sank his submarine, out through the flatlands toward Newark Bay and the sea. The water doesn't remember any of it. It just falls.